Okay, welcome everyone. To today's University of Texas Energy Symposium for September 30th, 2025. Carrie Keene, research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas at Austin, who sponsors this speaker series. Before I formally introduce today's speaker, I'll point out the next two talks upcoming. Next week, we'll have Santiago Grijalva from Georgia Tech, and he will be talking about emerging electricity grids, decentralization, and intelligence. The following week, we'll have Julia Black, who is from our municipal electric utility here, Austin Energy, and she will talk about the uniqueness of the Municipal Utilities Resiliency Program and how it fits into the ERCOT, or the Texas, for the most part, competitive wholesale market. So we'll learn about being an electric utility, a regulated utility within a competitive wholesale market. Today, it's a pleasure to have Wil Burns. He is the co-director for the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University, and the topic of his talk today is the potential role of marine carbon dioxide removal in combating climate change. So a little bit of background on Wil. He's the co-founding director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. This research center focuses on the social science aspects of carbon dioxide removal, including the law and governance, ethics and justice, the role of public engagement, and deliberation. Before this, he was associate director of the Environmental Policy and Culture Program at Northwestern University, also the founding director of the Energy Policy and Climate Program at Johns Hopkins, and he has taught at the University of Chicago, Stanford, and the University of California at Berkeley. He's former president of the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences, and in 2019, he was the recipient of that organization's Lifetime Achievement Award. He has his PhD in international law from University of Wales. A little background on his talk. Since the Paris Agreement, 2015, has become increasingly apparent that achievement of its temperature objectives will require both aggressive emissions reduction initiatives and large-scale deployment of carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions technologies to avoid passing critical thresholds and avoid temperature overshoot. Much of the early research on carbon dioxide removal focused on terrestrial approaches, and you can ask a question about that as well. Of course, there's been increasing attention on the potential role of the world's oceans, given sustainability considerations and the fact that oceans already serve as a huge carbon sink and have potential for storing more carbon. So this marine carbon dioxide removal, mCDR, include different technologies like ocean fertilization, alkalinity enhancement, ocean upwelling and downwelling, and biomass sinking. So he will talk about the risks and the opportunities for this, as well as the regulatory barriers. Let's please welcome Wil Burns.
All right. Thank you so much, Carrie, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming. And I will get started. I would encourage anybody that has questions along the way to ask them, because as you know, you never know what happens at the end in any of these in terms of the amount of time. So please feel free to do so. So the Paris Climate Agreement, right, as everybody knows, established the salutary goals of seeking to hold temperatures to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and at least strive to hold temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And at the 26th Conference of the Parties agreed that the goal should be to hold temperatures to only 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Unfortunately, if you look at the pledges that countries have made to date under Paris, the so-called nationally determined contributions, and you map that against what would be necessary to meet the temperature goals, you see a yawning gap. Under an intermediate emissions scenario through 2100, instead of temperatures being held to well below 2 degrees Celsius, much less 1.5 degrees Celsius, we see projections of temperatures increasing 2.9 degrees Celsius. In a high emissions scenario, which is definitely not beyond the pale at this point, temperatures increase by as much as 4.4 degrees Celsius over the course of this century. And what we know in terms of the science is that if temperatures rise 2, 3, or 4 degrees Celsius, it has potentially catastrophic implications, both in terms of human institutions as well as ecosystems. Just a few examples. if temperatures rise by 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we will see the complete melting of the Greenland ice cap. And this ice cap alone, when it melts, will result in sea level rise of about 20 feet. And we'll be locked into that sea level rise for about 4,000 to 5,000 years thereafter. The good news is it'll take 1,000 years to happen. The bad news is it'll be 4,000 to 5,000 years. And that's one ice cap among many. Virtually all of the world's coral reefs, which provide critical sustenance for about a third of all marine species, disappear if temperatures rise by 2 degrees Celsius. If temperatures rise by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that as many as 60% of species could be potentially in danger. And temperature increases of 2 degrees Celsius or more result in substantial drops in crop production, especially in the global south, increases in violent weather events, and all kinds of other economic harms. So it is not surprising, given the fact that we have not gotten our act together and we face these kind of perils, that we've started looking at the so-called Plan B options. And those Plan B options focus on this field that we call carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, right? And this is a working definition of CDR. It involves anthropogenic, so human activities that seek to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now that should be contrasted with carbon capture and storage that seeks to remove carbon from a point source, right? This is after it's already been released into the atmosphere and then seeks to durably store it. Usually durably is defined as at least 100 years, ideally hundreds of thousands of years, in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs. Now, up until very recently, most of the focus in the realm of carbon removal has been on these terrestrial options, things like planting trees, direct air capture plants that can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, enhancing the weathering of rocks to take up CO2 and so forth. But it's become increasingly obvious that from a technological standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from a sustainability standpoint, that these approaches alone are not going to be sufficient to get us to where we need to be. And where do we need to be in terms of carbon removal? The answer is we need to do a lot. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's been estimated that at this point, in order to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, not only do we have to do much more aggressive decarbonization of the economy, but we're also going to have to remove as much as 10 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere by the year 2050, and perhaps as much as 18 to 20 gigatons by the end of the century, right? It is a massive enterprise, and we've only sequestered approximately 0.25% of that amount at this point in terms of carbon removal. So as we've looked at terrestrial options and concluded that they're not going to get us there, we've started talking about marine options, right? And marine options make a lot of sense because the world's oceans currently already remove and store about 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually, or a third of all anthropogenic emissions, and they store 15 to 20 times as much carbon dioxide as all terrestrial sinks combined, right? So there's been an increasing focus. There's been companies that have been developed. There's research programs on how we might increase the uptake of carbon dioxide in the world's oceans through so-called marine carbon dioxide removal approaches, or mCDR. And so what I want to very briefly do is talk about some of those options that are being looked at most prominently in terms of the potential benefits they have in terms of taking up CO2, potential co-benefits, the risks associated with large-scale intervention in sensitive ocean ecosystems, and some of the challenges, economic, political, and so forth, of doing this in the long term. So I'll very quickly work through some of these approaches. I'll tell you at the outset, we roughly divide these approaches into two broad categories. Biotic, those that involve altering marine biology in one sort or another to effectuate more uptake of CO2, and abiotic, which involve chemical changes in the ocean. And we'll look at some abiotic and biotic examples through the course of this. The first of these that we look at is something called ocean iron fertilization. And this is kind of the OG of all the mCDR approaches. We have had the most research in the context of mCDR over the years. We've had 13 field research studies, so we know some about this approach. The essence of understanding ocean iron fertilization is to understand the role of a single-celled organisms called phytoplankton in the ocean. Phytoplankton take up carbon dioxide, convert it from inorganic carbon to organic carbon, and then use it in various processes, right? So the same sort of photosynthetic process that we see on land. And indeed, half of all the photosynthesis that occurs in the world occurs in the world's oceans through phytoplankton, okay? So phytoplankton take up CO2 and convert it. But most of that CO2 is almost immediately released again into the ocean because the vast majority of the phytoplankton are consumed by zooplankton species or other species, and the CO2 gets released again. However, a small portion of that CO2 it sometimes ultimately ends up dropping to the bottom of the ocean when the species die. And this is a process called the biological pump. And in that case, the CO2 gets buried in sediments and it ultimately stays out of the atmosphere for periods of 100 years or 1,000 years or more. Proponents of ocean iron fertilization argue that there are certain areas of the ocean that have optimal amounts of macronutrients, including nitrogen and phosphorus, for optimal growth of phytoplankton, but they have a shortage of a micronutrient that limits that phytoplankton growth. And that micronutrient is iron, right? And the primary area that we're looking at is the Southern Ocean, the areas around Antarctica. And so proponents of ocean iron fertilization argue that if we seeded those areas with iron, we would have a massive proliferation of phytoplankton, a lot more CO2 being taken up, and ultimately a reduction in atmospheric concentrations of CO2. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize at this point is that when phytoplankton take up CO2, that does not remove CO2 from the atmosphere, right? They're removing CO2 from the oceans. However, the oceans are in a pressure equilibration with the atmosphere. And so when you reduce the amount of CO2 in the oceans, it allows more CO2 from the air to flow into the oceans, right? And that's where you get the carbon removal, right? In this approach and most of the other approaches that we're talking about, right? So that's the idea behind ocean iron fertilization. Now, early on, when this was all based on kind of bench modeling, right? People were wildly enthusiastic about this process. Some studies indicated that we might be able to remove as much as 25% of all the CO2 in the atmosphere by doing this, right? And it would be really cheap, somewhere between $3 to $5 per ton, okay? The question then became, was that true, okay? And so then we started doing field research, right? And the field research ended up being a mixed bag for us, right? This is a result of one of the studies. One of the things we found out was when we seeded an area 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers with iron, we did indeed see a proliferation of algae, right? And we also saw decreases in the concentration of CO2 in that area, right? So that seems to be successful, right? The question, though, is does that phytoplankton hold that CO2 to the point that it drops below the light layer and can ultimately end up in the sediments, or is it released before then, right? And one of the other things that we found out in most of these field experiments is that when you create a proliferation of phytoplankton in an area, it's like a gigantic sushi bar if you're zooplankton, right? And so the zooplankton have rushed into the area, consumed the phytoplankton, and most of that CO2 has been released, right? So only 2 of the 13 studies that have been done found substantial amounts of CO2 being sequestered in phytoplankton dropping below the light layer, right? And so as a consequence, in more recent studies, there's been less and less enthusiasm about how much sequestration we can get. Another study a few years after the first study that said 25% said, well, maybe 10%, right? And then another study said maybe 5%, right? And the number has declined, right? And so that's a major question. Proponents, on the other hand, argue a couple of things. One, they say, let's suppose we can only get a gigaton, a billion tons of sequestration from this. And many of them claim that we can. If we're building a portfolio of carbon removal approaches, right, all the terrestrial ones we're looking at and the marine ones, and we need, 10 gigatons, if we could get one from this, it would be worth it, right? They also said that the research that we've done to date has been too limited in terms of its scope and in terms of the geographic areas. And they've called for more research. And Woods Hole, for example, is proposing an experiment off the coast of Alaska right now to do a much larger ocean fertilization experiment that would occur over a much larger period of time. But it's just unclear if this would work. The second question is, are there dangers in dumping large amounts of iron in ocean ecosystems, right? And the answer is yes, there are some serious risks that need to be taken into account. One of them is what happens if you're successful and you get a proliferation of phytoplankton, right? This is not like when you go to Macy's and you decide that you want to pick out a pair of socks and you decide what color and what texture you want, right? You get what you get, right? If you have this proliferation. And the fear that a lot of scientists have is that there'd be a proliferation of phytoplankton species that the zooplankton in the area didn't want to eat, right? And that could create a biological trophic cascade, right? Where the zooplankton populations then decline, and then the higher order species such as mammals that feast on zooplankton would also decline, right? And we have some empirical evidence of that. In one of the experiments in the Antarctic area, we had one phytoplankton species called Phaeocystis antarctica that massively proliferated, crowded out other phytoplankton in the area, and the zooplankton didn't want to eat it, right? Didn't matter because this was a very small experiment, but if we had done this at a basin-wide scale, right, it really could matter, right? So we need a lot more research to determine if that's a problem, okay? The second issue that we're worried about with phytoplankton production is something called nutrient robbing, okay? Again, let's say you're successful and you put all this iron in the ocean and phytoplankton start to proliferate. Well, guess what? They're not just eating iron, right? They're going to have to take up more of the macronutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. And it turns out in the Southern Ocean, in the area 30 degrees south and more southern than that, a lot of those nutrients naturally drift north into fisheries that are extremely important right now. All of a sudden now, if you have massive proliferation of phytoplankton in the Southern Ocean, they may take those nutrients away from those other areas, right? And two things will happen. One, it could wreak havoc with fisheries and create geostrategic tensions, right? Second of all, it could reduce the amount of phytoplankton being produced in those areas, which could kind of defeat the purpose, right, in terms of taking up CO2, right? So nutrient robbing. Proponents acknowledge the fact that this is a threat. They indicate that there's potential areas that we can do this in that won't have that happen, right? But we need a lot more research. And that may mean that the amount of this we can do, the scale that we can do this at, is lower than we thought, right? So we need to research that. So as apprehension about ocean iron fertilization has increased, there's been more focus on other kinds of marine carbon removal approaches, right? So I want to work through those. One that has become extremely popular at this point is ocean alkalinity enhancement, or OAE. Okay, so natural ocean alkalinity is driven by the presence of alkaline minerals in oceans, such as calcium carbonate, that are derived from microbes and corals and shellfish, right? Some rocks also, such as olivine and basalt, wash off of the land and ultimately end up in the oceans and create a certain level of alkalinity. Alkalinity is important from a standpoint of carbon removal. Ultimately, what happens is that alkalinity releases OH ions. Those OH ions combine with carbon dioxide and they convert the carbon dioxide to bicarbonates and carbonates, right? And those end up floating in the oceans for long periods of time and then can sink into sediments, right? And so it results in a substantial drawdown of CO2 in the process, right? That's the natural process, right? Unfortunately, in recent years, the amount of this that's happening has declined, okay? And so there's increasing interest in so-called ocean alkalinity enhancement. The idea would be to introduce more alkalinity into the oceans to create more drawdown of carbon dioxide, right? And there's various ways that one could do this. One way that you could do OAE is to take ships and go out into the ocean and put alkaline rich materials such as olivine and wollastonite and basalt into the oceans, right, to increase alkalinity. There's also an electrochemical approach, whereas you take ocean water on land and you utilize an electrochemical approach to separate acid and base, right? And then you take the base portion of that water, you introduce it back into the water to increase alkalinity. Okay, so ocean alkalinity enhancement is the approach that is receiving substantial amounts of funding right now from places like Europe, as well as a number of startup companies, right, that are doing field experiments. Okay, now some claim that ocean alkalinity enhancement could sequester somewhere between 1 to 2 gigatons of CO2 annually, right? So again, when we think about this portfolio, that would be well worth doing, right? But there's a number of challenges, first of all, associated with doing this. One is the cost, right? It's been estimated that this approach could cost us about $3 trillion annually, okay? It's a lot of money, okay? It's not impossible. We spend $3 trillion on a lot of things, right? And if we could get massive amounts of reductions of CO2, right, this could still be justified, right? Because unchecked climate change, of course, is going to create massive societal costs also, right? Proponents also argue that if we start doing this at scale and we utilize learning by doing, we'll bring this cost down a lot, right? But we're uncertain if that's going to be true. So that's one, that's a major challenge of doing this.
Can you clarify, 3 trillion gets you what?
3 trillion gets you a couple gigatons probably, right? So you have to calculate what the social cost of carbon is, right? And determine based on what you would project the impacts to be, if that's a cost beneficial sort of approach, right? And you have to assume that costs will come down, right, with scaling, but how much you don't know, right? Yeah.
I guess for like OAE and for all the the methods you discussed so far, I'm curious what is like the permanence of the CO2 storage? Like, is this like a band-aid that'll work for 100 years while we come up with something else? Or is
Yeah,
it
yeah,
like
it's a good
long-
question. Permanence varies between these approaches, and permanence is contested with a lot of these approaches. We're in early days of determining that. If you look at ocean iron fertilization, for example, that probably has the lowest level of permanence. But a lot of people think maybe that's 100, 200 years, right? That may sound like a lot, right? But if you put a molecule of CO2 into the atmosphere today, right, a large percentage of that CO2 will still be in the atmosphere 1,000 years from now, right? So it's not really what we call like for like, right? So that one, it would maybe buy you some time, right, but not get you where you need to be. Ocean alkalinity enhancement, by creating carbonates and bicarbonates, potentially gets you thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years of storage, right? So that one could give you a lot of bang for your buck, right? But again, remains contested, right? We know very little about sediment chemistry and some of the other things that would determine that in the long term, right? So that's one of the things that has to be researched. Okay. All right, challenges to ocean alkalinity enhancement, then risks of ocean alkalinity enhancement. One is that it turns out there's a lot of organisms in the oceans that have a very delicate balance in terms of pH and alkalinity, right? And so all of a sudden, if you're introducing large amounts of alkalinity, especially if you do it too quickly, you potentially could hurt some of those organisms, right? Mostly in a localized sort of area, but nonetheless, it's a concern, right? And so a lot of the experiments out there right now are trying to determine what the impacts are when you introduce alkalinity in terms of those localized sort of ecosystems, right? There's an experiment off the coast of Martha's Vineyard that just transpired, but from Woods Hole called Loch Ness, and they're now trying to process that data and see what the impact was on organisms, right? And so certain organisms like littoral crabs, for example, that we have some concerns about the introduction of alkaline materials. Another issue is that some minerals that are high in alkalinity that we might utilize, like olivine, for example, could release toxic metals like nickel and chromium into those systems, right? And the question is, does the releases reach levels that are toxic in terms of organisms, right? The good news is that a couple of the experiments to date have indicated that the releases of these metals are still well below the thresholds in which we would be concerned in terms of those organisms, but we need larger scale studies and we need them in more areas to be able to make those determinations, right? We're also looking at not using some of those things like olivine that are high in that, and instead using things like lime, for example, right, where there's a lot less of a threat in that context, right? But again, a lot more research to be done, right? There's biogeochemical concerns that we have. It could change the timing of phytoplankton blooms, for example, and that could have negative impacts in terms of ocean ecosystems. We're doing very preliminary research in that context also. Okay, third approach that we're looking at is seaweed farming, macroalgae farming. Okay, so currently, wild seaweed remove about 173 million tons of CO2 from the oceans, right? And then hold that CO2 when they drop to the bottom of the ocean and end up sequestered in sediments, right? Time frames for that contested, hundreds of years perhaps, maybe as much as 1,000 years, right? But that's what happens in the natural seaweed growth process. The idea of seaweed farming would be to create massive new stands of seaweed, right? And then probably do things like spray that seaweed on buoys. And as the seaweed grew, the buoys would become heavier, and then ultimately they would drop to the bottom of the ocean, and the seaweed would be holding the CO2, and it would result in a drawdown, okay? Some of the proponents of this, including companies that are involved in this, have claimed that we can sequester ultimately 1 to 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually, right? But that's a contested concept, right? The National Academy of Science, for example, did a study on all the mCDR approaches a couple of years ago, and they said, yeah, even if you occupy 20% of the world's oceans with seaweed, and you ain't going to do that, right? Mm-hmm. But even if you did, right, you might be able to sequester 1/3 of a gigaton, right? So there's a big difference between those estimates, and it's based on different methodological assumptions that, again, are going to require more research. There's also risks associated with large-scale production of seaweed. One is competition for nutrients with phytoplankton, right? They're both going to compete for the same nutrients, right? And there's some evidence that the seaweed will do better than the phytoplankton, and it could result in substantial declines in phytoplankton. Maybe a 30% decline by the year 2100. One study said maybe a 60% decline by 2300, right? Well, if that happened, number one, phytoplankton are at the base of the ocean ecosystem, right? So it could wreak chaos with ocean ecosystems. Second of all, again, if you're decimating phytoplankton populations, you're defeating a lot of the purpose, right, of taking up CO2 through seaweed, right? So we need a lot more research to determine if that will happen in all ocean ecosystems and where we would put it. Another thing that we're worried about is that there could be a large number of invasive species that would hitch a ride on these buoys, right? Because we need millions of these buoys deployed all over the ocean. And we have evidence that invasive species like to hang on those buoys and drift into other areas, right? And that could have ecosystem impacts, right? We also don't know in the deep oceans what the impacts would be on deep sea ocean organisms, which we know less about than we do than what we know about the moon, quite frankly. What will happen to those species when all of a sudden you start dropping huge amounts of new biomass on those species, right? And so early stages of research in that context, okay? All right, very quickly, last one, Ocean upwelling, this one is easy to understand because we've already talked about ocean iron fertilization. The idea here would be to put pipes at the bottom of the ocean and pump up nutrient-rich waters from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the ocean to increase the proliferation of phytoplankton, okay? This one probably does not have legs, right, for a number of reasons. One, it's not likely to get us that much in terms of sequestration, maybe half a gig, maybe a gig, but I doubt it. Second of all, it has a lot of risks, right? All of the risks associated with phytoplankton that we talked about before, but also in addition to pumping up large amounts of nutrients from the bottom of the ocean, guess what else is at the bottom of the ocean? Large amounts of carbon dioxide, right? And so if you pump up that CO2 and it outgasses into the atmosphere, you've kind of defeated your purpose, right? And so there are companies that are still pursuing this, but it's not likely that, in my opinion, that one will go very far. Okay, so let's now shift to the legal side of this, right? Here are approaches now that in many cases will be deployed in the global commons, right? Which will necessitate international regulation, or even if done within a country's exclusive economic zone, could have impacts on other countries' economic zones, right? So it requires international regulation. So who's doing that? How would we do it? Who else might be involved in the future? Well, to date, there have been two regimes, international treaty regimes, that have intervened when it comes to marine carbon removal. The first is called the London Convention. This was a convention created in the 70s to regulate dumping things into the world's oceans, right? So in 2008, they passed a resolution in response to these ocean iron fertilization experiments that were happening, including companies that were engaged in this, and said that they were going to try to sell credits in the voluntary carbon market, right? So the London Convention said, well, okay, slow your roll, okay? That we have good news and bad news for you, right? The good news is that under the treaty, there's an exception that says that if you're putting something in the ocean and it's not just for the purpose of disposing of it, but for some other reason, as long as it comports with the rest of the provisions of the treaty, it's not dumping and it doesn't get classified as such, right? So you don't need a dumping permit, right? That's the good news. But what they said was, okay, if you're doing ocean iron fertilization, you're not doing it for the purposes of throwing the iron away. You're trying to create phytoplankton. So it won't be dumping, but it has to comport with the rest of the provisions of the treaty. And the treaty seeks to protect ocean ecosystems. And to the extent that we don't know very much about what ocean iron fertilization would do, and we don't have any governance in place, we want to be extremely precautionary, okay? So here's what we're going to let you do. You can engage in ocean iron fertilization experiments, but purely for scientific research purposes. In other words, you can't be trying to sell carbon credits, okay? That obviously is a major problem if you're an ocean iron fertilization company, okay? Second thing is it's subject to risk assessment, right? And they subsequently developed a risk assessment framework that those of you that have had risk assessment will recognize this as a standard risk assessment framework. And this has to be signed off on by the government that has jurisdiction over your enterprise, right? So if you're a US company engaging in this, US government has to sign off, EPA would sign off on this risk assessment. Okay, so that's what's required under the London Convention. Now, there are a number of limitations about this approach. Okay, the first of them is that the resolutions that the London Convention passes are not legally binding on the parties. Okay, now before you get too cynical, okay, most countries adhere to most provisions of most of the resolutions most of the time. Okay, so it still does have impact, but it does have to be emphasized that it's voluntary in terms of complying with these resolutions, right? The second limitation is that, as you could see, the resolution was focused on ocean fertilization, right? So it's not going to regulate ocean alkalinity enhancement. It might regulate upwelling. It probably doesn't regulate seaweed either, right? So it's extremely limited in terms of its potential approach, right? Okay, so fast forward, there is another treaty that was created under the London Convention called the London Protocol. And this was created in the 1990s. And it was meant to be a more precautionary treaty to regulate the dumping of materials in the ocean, acknowledging that we now knew a lot more about what ocean dumping would do, right? So in 2013, the parties to the London Protocol passed an amendment to the treaty, right, to change the treaty language to regulate what it deemed to be marine geoengineering, right? And marine geoengineering was defined very broadly, right? Deliberate intervention in the marine environment to manipulate natural processes, right? So potentially much wider than what ocean fertilization did, right? And then it essentially incorporated the same provisions that we talked about in the resolution that was passed by the London Convention, right? It said that if you want to engage in marine geoengineering, you can only do it for scientific research purposes, subject to risk assessment, all kinds of other precautionary sort of language, right? And what they did is they carved out an annex, and they said any marine geoengineering approach that's in that annex is subject to these provisions, right? And they initially put ocean fertilization in there, and then they said other things could be added in the future to the annex, right? If 2/3 of the countries would ultimately agree to it, okay? Number of a number of evolutions from that. Subsequently, they indicated that they may want to put other approaches in that annex, right? And in the context of marine carbon removal, they talked about ocean alkalinity enhancement and seaweed, right? And they haven't added those yet, right? But that's under active deliberation, right? So then they would be regulating ocean fertilization, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and seaweed under this framework, right? And you would be limited to doing scientific research only and subject to risk assessment, right? One of the things that marine carbon removal companies hate, by the way, about this approach is that there appears to be no exit ramp from scientific research, right? How do you determine, if any, how you move from doing scientific research to being authorized to actually monetizing this, right? Because if you can't do that, right, you're not going to be able to keep these companies alive, right? And it's unclear, right, under London if they can do that or if they have any interest, quite frankly, in allowing that in the future. Now, limitations to this approach are a bunch, okay? One is that this amendment has not come into force, meaning it's not legally binding because it requires 2/3 of the parties, and there's like 57 parties in the protocol. It requires 2/3 of the parties to the protocol to accept the amendment before it becomes legally binding. And that's, roughly in the 30s, right? Right now, only 6 countries have accepted that amendment, right? So it's not legally binding on anybody at this point, though some countries are voluntarily adhering to it or incorporating it into their own legislation. Germany, for example, has done this. Australia is about to do this, right? But that's one major limitation of this approach. Second of all, there's one small actor that's not a party to the London Protocol, and that's us, right? And I mean that as a joke because most of the mCDR companies in the world are based in the United States, right? And to the extent that we are not a party to the London Protocol, they're not subject to any of this regulation, right? And the chances of us ratifying an international environmental treaty at this point, right, are about the same chance that I'll be the quarterback for the Cowboys, right? It's not going to happen, right? So that's a serious limitation in terms of this approach, right? All right. The other treaty regime that intervened in this context was the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is the treaty that regulates the threats to biodiversity. It was created in the 1990s. There's 196 parties to this treaty. And they also passed a resolution starting in 2008 and then 2010 to regulate these approaches. And essentially, they took the same approach as the London Convention, right? It's broader in some ways, right? It refers ultimately to geoengineering, right, which is a broader term that can encompass all of these marine approaches and a lot of the terrestrial approaches, right? And it says it's subject to risk assessment, and you can only do it for scientific research purposes, right? So that's the CBD. Limitations to the CBD. One, CBD resolutions are not legally binding on the parties, okay? Two, there's a small country that's not a part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. That's us, right? And so again, all these mCDR approaches, US companies are not subject to it, or anybody who's flagged with a US vessel. There's also a biodiversity framework that was created in 2022 under the CBD that talks about mitigation measures, including through nature-based solutions. And so it might be argued that these approaches that look like nature-based solutions, such as seaweed farming, for example, might actually be privileged under the CBD, right? And so there's debate ensuing about whether the CBD might actually try to facilitate some of this in the future. So very quickly, other treaties that might intervene in the future, the Law of the Sea Convention, right? The Constitution of the Oceans. The Law of the Sea Convention provides for a right to conduct marine scientific research. And so that might privilege some of the mCDR research. At the same time, it provides for liability if you create harm in ecosystems or to humans as a consequence of doing this, right? And so this might be pursued under the Law of the Sea Convention. It also has measures that seek to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment. And pollution is defined as introduction of substances or energy that have deleterious effects, right? That could potentially encompass ocean alkalinity enhancement or seaweed, any of these things that might have negative impacts, right? It also doesn't seem to have comparative risk assessment, right? It doesn't acknowledge that introducing these things might actually help protect ocean ecosystems from climate change, right? And how do you weigh that against the risks of intervening in this way, right? But the regime wasn't really designed to do that, and it may happen in the future, it may not. We have a new treaty called the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty that is going to go into force in January. It regulates things on the open oceans. It may have a role to play in this, right? It establishes marine protected areas, for example. And so it may be that marine protected areas are created that exclude marine carbon removal approaches from being deployed in those areas, right? And the parties will ultimately have to debate that. It also requires environmental impact assessment. It requires consultation with other countries that might be potentially impacted by activities on the open oceans, right? So if we were going to deploy ocean alkalinity enhancement in the open oceans, there's going to be that consultation process. It also allows the scientific body of the BBNJ to weigh in, which could create some additional pressure on project developers in terms of the potential harms that their approaches might create, right? And we'll see what happens. The Paris Agreement, this could be a way that one of the ways that countries meet their nationally determined contributions. The pledges that they make are for mitigation, and mitigation is defined as efforts to reduce emissions or enhance sinks. And sinks are things that take up carbon dioxide, right? To that extent, it's likely that you will see countries in the future as part of their pledges saying that we're going to engage in carbon removal, right, as part of our mitigation pledges, right? And the countries, and Paris will then regulate some of those approaches, right? And it has language in its preamble that talks about recognizing the human rights impacts of how you respond to climate change, right? And it might be argued that some of these mCDR approaches would have human rights impacts, right? If it negatively impacted the right to food, right? For example, through nutrient robbing. If it positively impacted the right to food by protecting the oceans from climate change, right? Again, a balancing process, right? And parties will ultimately have to figure out what to do with that, right? And then finally, I say, in a lot of these approaches that might be deployed in a coastal area, right? There'll be regulations by domestic entities, right? This is just an example in the United States. If you were going to use large amounts of olivine and dump it in the ocean, you're going to have to mine that olivine, right? And so there's going to be mining laws, including all the health and safety and environmental regulations associated with it. We have a law that implements the London Convention called the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, right? That would have to be employed, right? It creates all kinds of interesting questions about whether the statutes we have in place that are largely anti-pollution statutes can be used to apply to marine carbon approaches. One of the things that the MPRSA says is that you should always seek to minimize the amount of substances that you're putting in the ocean, right? But in the case of some of these approaches, you don't want to do that, right? You want to put a lot of it in the ocean to get the impacts, right? So how do you fit these approaches that were never contemplated in the 70s when we created our pollution statutes to these approaches, right? Do you create bespoke new regulatory frameworks? That's not going to happen anytime soon, especially in this political environment, right? So how do you fit those things inside of the existing statutes in a way that makes sense, right? It's a major challenge. And Clean Water Act, coastal zoning, National Environmental Policy Act for major projects are all potentially part of this also, right? And so what I'll say in conclusion, just in general about carbon removal, is there's some projections that the carbon removal industry could be a trillion-dollar industry or even larger in the long term, right? There's going to be interesting jobs in this field that are going to require engineers, going to require business people, we're going to require policy people, law people. It's a good arrow in your quiver to at least know something about, because there's opportunities, and it'll be a dynamic field in which we need thoughtful people to ensure that if we go down this path, we do it in a way that's careful and responsible. Thank you very much.
All right, any questions from the room? Students, yeah, so.
Yeah, sure. So one thing I was thinking about, it seems like it would be difficult to like measure or verify or demonstrate like who achieved the emissions reductions.
Yeah.
So like one thing about like direct air capture is, okay, it's pretty easy to measure how much CO2 you captured and put in the ground. And maybe that would make it easy to like pay that company a subsidy, or maybe someone wants to buy carbon offsets or something like that. But if a bunch of companies are just like going out and spreading iron in the ocean or making the ocean more alkaline in different locations, like how are you going to measure or verify each actor's contributions to like reducing atmospheric CO2? Like,
Yeah,
are there,
a very good question. I skipped over this one, for the interest of time, right? But this is a big issue in this field. It's called MRV, right? Measurement, reporting, and verification, right? And as you suggested, there's certain approaches in carbon removal, so-called closed system approaches, black boxes like direct air capture, right? Where it's pretty easy to measure how much CO2 you capture inside of that box, right? But then we have open system approaches where it's much more difficult. Enhanced rock weathering in terrestrial surfaces, where we're putting olivine and wollastonite stuff and letting it weather, right? And then take up CO2. And then ultimately the CO2 is converted to carbonates, washes into water tables, goes through rivers and lakes and ends up in the ocean, right? That's a lot happening there, right? And so measuring, right, and using proxies like cation releases, right, to determine how much CO2 is being taken up is subject to a lot of noise in those systems, right? Oceans are that problem on steroids, right? And just an example, you raised one of the things. What happens if you have a bunch of companies in an area, right? Who's going to get credit, right? And who gets credit matters, because at least right now, you're selling those credits on a voluntary carbon market, right? And Microsoft's buying about 80% of all those credits. Nobody else is buying these things. So let's just say Microsoft. So Microsoft's buying these credits. They're going to want to know damn sure that if they're buying them from you, it's your intervention that effectuated that carbon removal. And if you have a bunch of companies in an area, it's going to make it difficult, right? Even before you get to that, it's actually being able to measure the fact that you took up CO2 for your intervention, right? And let's just use an example of ocean alkalinity enhancement. Let's say you put a bunch of olivine in the ocean. It turns out that air-sea flux exchange, where you get the change in equilibration, right, may occur hundreds of miles away from where your intervention was, right? And a lot of things have happened along the way. How do you know that air-sea flux exchange is a result of your intervention and not a lot of other natural processes or other anthropogenic interventions, right? Second of all, that air-sea flux exchange might occur a year or two after your intervention, right? And so again, all of the statistical noise in that system, right, has to be taken into account. We're trying to deal with the second issue primarily through better modeling, through better modeling, better monitoring also, right? Using things like Argo floats and other sort of things to be able to more accurately measure air-sea flux exchange, right? But it's going to take time. It's expensive, right? And in a market that lives and dies by being able to quantify, you know, each ton, right? It is another challenge.
Follow-up question. Say that we have offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And we did imply this. Looking at the bigger picture, would that affect the national carbon budget or the international carbon budget? And is it buying us time or is it a long-term technology to solve the carbon?
Yeah. It's a long-term technology. It'll be contested in terms of how you divide that budget, right? Yeah. It's one of the reasons that there are a lot of proponents in this area that say we have a sense that this approach could be effective and it could effectuate quite a bit of carbon removal, but accurately measuring it, right, is going to be very difficult. Maybe we acknowledge this as a public good and we spend government money on this. We don't try to exactly quantify it and sell it like we sell pork bellies, right? But that's going to require government money, right? And so right now we run it through these voluntary carbon markets, but the conundrum we have in that case is being able to accurately calculate it, right? And then when you throw the international component in, it makes it even more difficult. Yeah, right.
Thank you for today. How have companies in the United States responded to international treaties? Although federally we're not bound to them, are they following international norms? They've
responded stupid. Okay. It's a sore subject for me. So I was involved. This is an anecdote, but it's probably one that cuts across a lot of these companies. So years ago, I was on a advisory board for a company called Running Tide, and they're a Maine-based company, and they were involved in seaweed farming. Okay, and Running Tide was kind of the darling, the marine carbon removal industry at the time. They had gotten about $30 million in funding. That may not sound like a lot because those of you that live in the oil patch, but it's a lot of money if you're a carbon removal company, right? So they had gotten 30 million in VC funding. They were on their way. They were doing research, and the advisory board provided them with legal advice, but mostly science advice. I was the token law person. There were a bunch of marine scientists, and they were doing it a few miles off the coast of Maine, right? So one day they came to us and they said, we're going to start putting buoys out in the middle of the Atlantic, about 300 miles out, right? And I remember telling them at the time, well, you're going to have to engage now with the London Convention, right? And the London Protocol, because they've got all these rules. They hired a law firm from Seattle who said, well, you're not subject to those things. The resolutions aren't binding, and we're not a party to the London Protocol, so just tell them to screw off, right? The problem with that is that may be legally, technically true, right? But if you're a investor, a venture capitalist, you do not want to be investing in something that an international regime has said you're doing is illegal, whether it is technically illegal or not. That making that argument politically is often a bad argument, right? And so the answer is a lot of these companies are just doing it and hoping that they don't get caught. And some of them are getting caught. Running Tide no longer exists, right? It got a lot of bad press from doing this and kind of being perceived as defying international regimes. And there's a number of other companies that are on the radar screen of London too. The other thing that happens is when these companies act like that and kind of extend their middle finger to these regimes, the regimes then react in a way that's probably more stringent than is necessary in some ways, but that's because they're pissed at that point, right? That they're being ignored. And so the amendment to the London Protocol and some of the resolutions that they've passed since then have probably been more strict in their terms of their regulation than they would have been if companies would have cooperated, right? Now, I'm going to give you the flip side of that. You're a company, you only have $5 or $10 million, you're spending most of that on engineering, and if you don't sell some damn carbon credits soon, you're going out of business, right? And you have a regime that tells you can only do scientific research, and it doesn't tell you ever how you get past that, right? There's no stage gating, right? That says if we don't see these kind of impacts at this scale, you move to the next scale, and then ultimately we're going to give you an on-ramp to do this commercially, right? That doesn't exist under London, right? So I get the frustration, but the problem is that the international regimes hold most of the cards, right? And so you have to really work with them. And a lot of the companies, in my opinion, haven't tried to do that, and that's been at their peril.
If we have like a pie chart of in the world where ocean CO2 removal is going on, how much of that's actually happening like in the US by American companies compared to Europe or maybe China? And do you see any of the methods you mentioned today becoming economically viable in the near future?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I want to say at the outset is that all carbon removal enterprises combined is small, right? So there's a website you can go to. It's called CDR.FYI, okay? And that site looks at how much carbon removal is necessary by the year 2050, right? It estimates we need 10 gigatons, and then it estimates how much carbon removal purchases have been made to date, right? And we're at about 0.037% of what we need for that 10 gigs, right? We're at very early stages. Now, it may accelerate massively, right, over the course of the next 10 years, right? Or it may not, right? But it's very small, right? And within that, marine carbon removal is a almost infinitesimal sliver, right? Because we're at very early stage. The TRL for a lot of these approaches, 4, 5 maybe, right? We just don't know enough about it. We haven't done enough research in terms of risk assessment, stuff like that, right? So there was a sale of 200,000 credits by a company called Gigablue a couple of weeks ago. Another company sold about 40,000 tons of credits recently. So there's some market transactions with mCDR, but it's very, very small right now. So in that pie chart, it's a very small pie chart for carbon removal, and for marine carbon removal, right, a crumb in your pie.
Sorry, can you repeat the website?
CDR.FYI.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. It'll show you how much carbon removal's been purchased, who the companies are that are selling it, who's buying it.
Maybe we'll end. You have one more in the room? Yeah, go back.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving your talk. I guess I'm curious, has there been any way of modeling or predicting in a rigorous way what the public response to kind of the ocean CDR methods will be? Because I would imagine, these can all prosper, and no matter how justified the technology is, I mean, people are going to defend the ocean no matter what, regardless of if these methods are proven safe or not.
Yeah. That's a big issue. It's an issue that we work a lot on, the issue of public engagement and public deliberation, right? And it's a mixed bag. One of the things that we know in the kind of concentric rings of risk that people view carbon removal, the tightest concentric ring, the thing that are the most concerned with our marine carbon removal approaches, because they perceive the oceans as being pristine and not intervened in, right? That's not true, right? But it is a perception, right? And so there's a lot of concern about any of those sort of approaches. There's a lot of stakeholders. There's tourism, there's fishers, and so forth, right? That are engaged in those areas. And how you do carbon removal engagement matters a lot, right? For a couple of examples that show you kind of the yin and yang of that was there was a company called Planetary, it's an ocean alkalinity company. They went to Cornwall, right? They got a local permit, and then after they got the permit, then they decided to have a 2-hour listening session in the area, right? So the public knew they already had the permit, and that was a slap in the face to the public, right? Because it's like this is just a dog and pony show, right? Second of all, the company did not analyze the context in which they were coming, the historical context. There had recently been cutbacks in waste treatment funding by the UK government that had created massive sewage releases in pipe outfalls in the area. And guess what Planetary's approach would use? A pipe outfall, right? That would have been something important to know when you talk to the community, right, in terms of what their concern should be. There was also a historic legacy of mining that had created dumping of lots of tailings and things into the ocean ecosystems that had affected those areas. And so you needed to be able to really acknowledge that kind of context and talk to those communities, and also not do it in 2 hours, right? You had to figure out who the key stakeholders were, engage with them on a long-term sort of basis, talk about community benefits of these kind of approaches and so forth. That's what another company called Ebb Carbon did in Washington, right? In Washington, Washington is extremely cautious when it comes to environmental stuff, right? But they did all of those things, right? They engaged the tribes early on. They engaged in kind of deliberation about the approach. They asked the community to help them co-develop the proposal, and that proposal was successful, right? So how you do community engagement, whether you do it respectfully and with real knowledge and in advance of having made the decision, makes a huge difference in terms of the outcome that you get, right? Not always. There may be some areas that are NIMBY, right, and just don't want it no matter what, right? But you got a much better chance if you proceed in a methodical fashion to do respectful and robust engagement.
All right, one this question online, slight twist from me. So what role do you think electrochemical technologies play in carbon dioxide removal? Their compatibility with renewable energy and electrochemical CO2 conversion, and maybe you could highlight on top of that the prioritization given to perhaps renewable electricity and powering some of these maybe more terrestrial systems.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the electrochemical. Electrochemical is having a star turn right now. One of the things that people like about electrochemical is, again, you're not dumping things into materials into the oceans, right? You're taking in ocean water, you're returning ocean water back into the oceans. You've simply removed the acidity. You have to figure out where to put that acid. That's not a small measure. The other thing that you have to acknowledge is that it's expensive. Right now, that approach is somewhere around $800 to $1,000 per ton of CO2 capture. That ain't viable in most places until, so we'd have to bring the cost down. There's quite an energy requirement for that, as somebody was suggesting. But there are a number of companies that are engaged in electrochemical that seem to be doing okay. And the first Clean Water Act permit to do an electrochemical approach was actually signed off on under the Trump administration, right? So there's some evidence that the Trump administration, despite having a bit of hostility to some climate approaches, is a bit more solicitous to carbon removal for whatever reason that is. And so these approaches are proceeding, and electrochemical is one of them. But energy is an issue with electrochemical. Energy is a big issue with terrestrial approaches. We talked about direct air capture, right? These gigantic filtration systems, essentially, that would take in CO2, separate out the CO2, capture it out in amines, solvents, and other kinds of approaches, right? And then ship it for storage somewhere. The problem with direct air capture is it requires huge amounts of energy, right? Energy all through the system, but the biggest part is in the regeneration process. When the filtration systems take in all the CO2, you now have to taken off of those systems so you can put them back in place to capture more CO2, that requires a huge amount of energy. One study said that if we were doing direct air capture at scale, if we were doing it at 3 or 4 gigatons a year, we might need 25% of all of our primary energy to do it, right? Now, we're not going to run these with fossil fuels, right? So we're going to run those with renewables. The question then becomes, assuming there's not an unlimited amount of renewables, right? And some of these companies argue there could be, right? We'll just keep funding more renewables, but let's assume it's a fixed quantity of renewables. Is that the best way to use your renewables, right? Would it be better to try to electrify everything in the world? Or is it better to, first of all, burn the fossil fuels, release the CO2 in the atmosphere, and then remove it back from the atmosphere, right? A lot of people don't think that makes a whole lot of sense, right? From a standpoint of prioritizing our renewables, right? So that's a major question. One, can they bring down the amount of energy that those systems use, right? And they're certainly trying to do that. They're using things like cryogenic processes, right? That might get us there. And second of all, can we grow the pie of renewables, right? And so certain states like Washington are now requiring that if you're going to put a direct air capture plant in place, you have to bring your own renewables with you. You can't take them off the grid, right? So that's an additional investment that you need to make, right? And maybe that'll work. Some of those companies say this will be a great for the community because we'll invest in those renewable projects, and then we'll feed a bunch of the other electrons we don't use into the grid, right? And grow the renewable pie, right? If that happens, yeah, maybe it's great, right? But who knows?
All right, let's thank Wil Burns for the.